Hi, everyone. My name is Gail Albert, and I have the honor of welcoming you all to the third program in the 9th annual film and discussion series, Building Local Resilience in Response to Global Challenges. Tonight's program is Hudson Valley Farms Hub's Farmscape Ecology. Presented jointly by Woodstock Land Conservancy, Woodstock, New York Transition, and Woodstock Jewish Congregation. Woodstock Land Conservancy is a nonprofit organization committed to the protection and preservation of the open lands, forests, water resources, scenic areas, and historic sites in Woodstock and the surrounding area. Woodstock Transition is part of the global transition town movement of communities working to reimagine and rebuild our world in response to the challenges of our time. Woodstock Transition has 7 active working groups that engage locally to strengthen our community's resilience and create positive alternatives. The Woodstock Jewish Congregation is dedicated to the advancement of Jewish ethics, religion, and culture, including the Bible's commandment that humans be guardians of the earth. The WJC draws from all streams of Jewish practice, is committed to treat all people with care and respect, and strives to become a model of environmental stewardship for its congregation and the larger community. Hudson Valley's rich heritage of agriculture and biodiversity is threatened by climate change, habitat destruction, and the loss of farms. Our program tonight is about the work of the Farm Hub, a 15-acre nonprofit farm in Hurley, which hosts an enormous number of programs addressing these issues, often in collaboration with other agencies. The specific focus tonight is on the research of the Hub's Farmscape Ecology program, which is exploring the connection between agricultural practices and biodiversity in our area, with the goal of finding ways to grow food that is specific to our region and that will sustain the entire ecosystem along with our farms. Brooke Pickering-Cole, Executive Director of the Farm Hub, will open with an overview of the region's need to maintain biodiversity while promoting farming, and will describe some of the Farm Hub's work. Anne Bloomfield, Farmscape Ecology Program Manager, and Conrad Vispo of the Hawthorne Valley Farmscape Ecology Program will then talk about their research. And they will be followed by the fascinating short film, Farmscape Ecology, which was created so beautifully by John Bowermaster in 2020. Many thanks to John. After that, we will have a Q&A moderated by Joan Apter with Anne, Conrad, and Eddie Clevenger, Director of Farm Operations at the Farm Hub. Georgia Asher will then close the program with some final information. A few technical points. First, please post your questions in the Q&A section, which is at the bottom of your screen, so that Joan can read them. Please do not post in the chat. For you, second, this program has auto captions if you choose to enable them. If you look at the line at the bottom or maybe the top of your screen, you will see the words live transcript. Click on live transcript, then you will see show subtitle. If you do enable auto captions, you probably want to turn them off for the film because that comes with its own captions. To do that, just click live transport again and click hide subtitle. You can turn them back on or off at any time during the webinar. Finally, thanks to everyone who made this event possible and to you for coming, and including our hosts and co-hosts, Carolyn Ritchie, Etta Grover, and Amy Wu. And now I turn this over to Brooke.
Thank you, Gail. And thank you so much to the 3 organizations for hosting us this evening. I kind of admit that I wish we were going to be sitting in a dark theater eating popcorn together, but it's nice to be in the virtual space, and I'm thankful for that. Also very happy to just have a few minutes to share some of our work at the Farm Hub and Farmscape Ecology, which is a body of work that's really central to the Farm Hub's mission, which is to support equity and ecology in the regional food system. And as a farm, what we really mean by this is promoting agriculture that's good for the planet, that is good for the people who do the work, and that is in service to everybody in our communities, right? Not just the elite few who can frequent the best restaurants. I'm sure that most of you tonight watching are local, but for those of you who aren't, we are a nonprofit education and demonstration farm just south of Kingston in the Hurley Flats on about 1,500 acres. We came into being 7 years ago when our funder, Novo Foundation, purchased the farm from what was then the Gill Farm, a 3-generation, very well-known family farm, mostly engaged in growing sweet corn for the wholesale market. And the idea was to complement Novo's philanthropic efforts around community well-being and food and agriculture, to create a land base from which to conduct crop research and organics, and also provide education for farmers. And in kind of a broader, sort of longer range sense, deal with, at least at the local level, some of the problems caused by the environmental mess that we're all in. And the issues that industrialized agricultures have created, whereby we are all dependent on many fewer and much larger farms at a great distance from us, and corporations producing the food that we eat. And we see the impact of all of this, you know, everywhere, and here in the Hudson Valley too, right? Extreme weather events, we've seen flooding, erosion, new and different pressures in terms of pests and diseases and crops. We've lost 30% of our farmland since the 1980s, and you know, we've got some public health issues, just like most of America. 1 in 3 adults in Ulster County are obese. 1 in 10 adults are food insecure right here in Ulster County. But you know, there's good news. And as most of you know, this is a really special place to live, and we're not crazy to be optimistic. In the 7 counties in the Hudson Valley, we've got well over 2,000 farms on over 300,000 acres. And a lot of them, in spite of having to pivot, you know, in very different ways this past year, a lot of them are doing pretty well. Almost 500 of these farms are in Ulster County. We've got proximity to New York markets. We've got an incredible local customer base, and an increasing one that's hugely supportive of small farms and CSAs. And we've got young people wanting to go into farming, and all sorts of strengths. In addition to these things, I think this region is particularly strong in its nonprofit organizations, a lot of whom are available to support farmers with programming and technical assistance, and also community groups working to fight food insecurity. And I think it's fair to say that the Farm Hub would not have existed if it weren't the case, right? We knew that all along, our work would be highly dependent upon partnerships and relationships with other organizations. And many of them have been here a lot longer than we have, like Scenic Hudson. They hold an easement on our property, for example. American Farmland Trusts, Farm to Institution, New York State, we've been involved with for a long time. National Young Farmers Coalition is based in Hudson. We've got the Rondeau Valley Growers Association in our neighborhood, doing great things and going strong for 15 years. 2 of our most important education and research partners from the very beginning are Cornell University and Cornell Cooperative Extension of Ulster County. They've been doing annual research trials around vegetable production, organic vegetable production, disease and pest management in grains and vegetables, and also our small grains trials, which are now in their 7th year, and going into flour and baking trials with local bakers in the region. And we're seeing some really great collaborations coming out of all of this. One of them that was born out of kind of a disaster, but has turned out to be very positive, is the Kingston Emergency Food Collaborative, which was created with 10 or 12 organizations last spring responding to the pandemic. And they got together really quickly and shared volunteers and coordinated meal and grocery bag deliveries to hundreds and hundreds of families in Kingston. And, you know, this is something that's going to live on after the pandemic, and much to the benefit of the people in Kingston. But in our first few years transitioning the farm, you know, what we had to do was really change totally, not only what was going to be grown on the farm, but also how it would be grown. And our rotation now includes cover crops, field crops like wheat, rye, corn, dry beans, and a large-scale vegetable operation on about 30 acres. And we've actually shifted to donating almost all of our vegetable production now to the emergency feeding system, food pantries all around the region. We donated 220,000 pounds of food last year, which we're pretty proud of. So definitely through these years, we've been able to take steps that a lot of typical farms wouldn't be able to take so nimbly. We took some areas of the farm out of production to reduce erosion and also increase habitat, for example. We also built a slightly different employment model with our production staff, which has been really successful for us. We brought them all full-time year-round a couple of years ago, so their lives wouldn't be upended by having to go south to find work in the winter. To do that, we added greenhouses for winter production. We also added literacy, computer literacy training, language classes, and safety trainings to the winter schedule. And our work with the Spanish-speaking and bilingual crew has taught us so very much. And we now have a full-fledged program called Language Justice, which is all about creating multilingual spaces for full participation and for dignity. And it all started just, you know, it all just grew out of our getting to know one another and trying to communicate in the earlier years. We're also adding new infrastructure right now. Some of you may have seen driving by, we're about to complete a very big LEED certified machine shop with offices attached for our production staff. They're going to be moving in May. And we're particularly excited about this space because in here, we're going to be able to provide trainings year-round indoors in tractor operation and tractor repair. And this is something, and we'll be able to do it in 2 languages. And this is something that's really needed. You know, not everybody who wants to go into farming grew up fixing stuff around their parents' farm. So that's going to help a lot of people. And also farm workers who aren't typically offered trainings in their own language. Last but not least on programs is Farmscape Ecology, which is in essence about the relationship between agriculture and nature. This film that you're going to see is the 3rd film that we've done with John Bowermaster, who's Hudson Valley Treasurer, and his 2 colleagues, Chris and Devin, who've gotten to know the farm really well. The other 2 films are on our website, Growing with the Grains, which is about our grains research at the farm, and also Seeds of Hope, which is about our partnership with the Mohawk Akwesasne and Seed Shed. But tonight's all about our ecology work, but please, if you do have questions about other things that we're doing, I welcome you to contact us through our website. Amy Wu, our communications manager's contact info is on the site. She'd be happy to answer questions or you know, send you over to somebody who can. And just to close on kind of a personal note, I want to mention that I spent the first 30 some years of my life in cities. And my introduction to agriculture was, other than shopping in farm stands, was really when I got involved in community development here in my town, which is Marbletown, in the early 2000s. And at the time, there was a lot of concern about housing development, a lot of interest in farmland protection and land protection in general. And we got a grant to do a natural heritage plan and another grant to do a farmland protection plan. And in that process, as is typical, I'm sure this happens in Woodstock a lot, we did a bunch of community conversations. And those conversations started, as you might expect, with view sheds. They got more interesting and became about food security and what's in school food and the impact of farming on the local economy. But when I think back on it, those conversations were very segmented. We talked to the farmers over here about farming, and we talked about woodland and water conservation and wetlands and biodiversity to the environmental commissioners and the hikers and the nature people, and maybe even a couple of hunters every now and then. And then we talked about the business aspect with all the shop owners, but it didn't really feel like anybody was thinking those people belonged in the same room together. And of course they do. And of course they are much more now than they used to be. And you're gonna see this in the film. Wildlife biologists working really closely with farmers and researchers and scientists and students. And, you know, I think with all the challenges that I mentioned that we're seeing around us and this really difficult, kind of horrible year that we've all been through, it's nice to know that a lot of things actually are really getting better. And I think this kind of cross-pollination is definitely one of them. I'm really happy to introduce 3 people who bring that approach almost every day to the Farm Hub during the growing season. Eddie Clevenger, our Director of Farm Operations. He's a seasoned organic farmer and actually really the person who makes everything happen at the farm every day. Conrad Vispo, a wildlife ecologist. He's been with Hawthorne Valley Farms since 2003. And together with Ann Bloomfield, he co-coordinates the Applied Farmscape Ecology Research Collaborative. Whoa, that's a hard one. And Ann Bloomfield, finally, she's the manager of our Farmscape Ecology program. She's a wildlife biologist, a bird expert, and a super interesting person. And that, I think, comes through in the film. And you'll see that now as I hand this over to her to introduce you to the film and Farmscape Ecology. Thank you.
Thanks, Brooke. So I was thinking about how to best introduce the topic and the film tonight, and I thought I would start with a quick story. So this past June, I walked out to my vegetable garden on a still, warm evening, and this is something I do several times a day in the growing season, seeking not only to check on the plants, but also to discover. And I have a fondness for finding the smallest creatures and watching them for a long time, not unlike one of my favorite authors, Annie Dillard. This is just one of the countless ways that my garden at home nourishes me. So on this particular evening, I noticed a small fly, and it had bright red eyes and a dark body, and it was hanging seemingly motionless by one arm from a leaf. And I thought at first that the fly was dead. Perhaps some illness or trouble had caused it to perish in place, but no. I looked closer, as I often do in these cases, wondering what the fly was trying to show me. And even smaller still was a tiny, perhaps a small midge that the fly was feeding on. And it held its prey with one leg while it continued to hang suspended from the leaf with another leg. And it just hung there in the air, hanging by the edge of the large eggplant leaf and chewing on its meal, or perhaps sucking the juices out of its meal, I'm not sure. And I imagined what it would be like if a human tried to do such a thing. How clumsy we would be catching our food in midair, alighting on a leaf by one arm and enjoying a meal. So I looked closer, amazed by the fly's everyday life, so ordinary to the fly. And then the fly dropped the prey, possibly sucked dry, and it flew off. And as I watched the eggplant, I noticed more of the flies hanging from the leaf edges by one arm with smaller bugs in their mouths, just like the first fly. And as the days passed, I observed that the flies would come out to the eggplant patch each evening around the same time, perhaps when their favorite prey came out. And each evening I ignored my chores and tasks, and I would watch the flies in amazement. And now my specialty is birds, but the great thing about being an ecologist is that if one thing isn't your specialty, you usually know someone who can help you out. So I contacted Conrad over at Hawthorne Valley, again, who's on the panel with us tonight. And I said, Conrad, I must know what these flies are. And of course, Conrad being the bug guy, he has got back to me quite quickly. And he said the flies were likely in the family Hybotidae, also called the dance flies. And I learned that this foraging strategy is quite specific to this type of fly. And now I don't tell you the story to convince you to set aside your daily responsibilities and instead watch flies. But as we view the film and we chat more, I would encourage you to think about ways in which you can engage with this topic of biodiversity and food production in your daily lives. You know, maybe you have a garden in your backyard or some plants at home that you can make observations on, and to consider not just what you might know and understand about these relationships, but what you have yet to discover. Again, I'm Ann Bloomfield. I'm the Applied Farmscape Ecology Program Manager at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub in Hurley. And tonight we're going to be exploring the Applied Farmscape Ecology Research Collaborative, which is the focus of the film. And as Brooke mentioned, the Applied Farmscape Ecology Research Collaborative is co-coordinated by me at the Farm Hub and Conrad at the Hawthorne Valley Farmscape Ecology Program. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Conrad, who's going to talk a little bit more about this before we move to the film. Conrad?
Thanks, Ann. And I have a lot to thank Ann for, not just the introduction, because she actually is the one at the Farm Hub who greets all the researchers when they come, make sure we're in the right place, we have our permits and all that sort of stuff. So a lot of thanks to Ann and to Brooke and to Eddie and to the rest of the people at the Farm Hub. Yeah, and I just wanted to take the few minutes that I have to reflect a little bit on how I approach some of this work. And one of the things that, or one of the images that comes to me as I think about the landscape and as I think about farms is to imagine life as a wash across the landscape. You've got insects, and you've got plants, and you've got birds, and you've got all sorts of different organisms that are living across that landscape kind of like a blanket in movement. They're flowing across that landscape. And each little element in that landscape, be it a mountain, be it a valley, be it a river, influences that flow of life. But the thing is that we do too. So all the different things that we create in that landscape, our parking lots, our buildings, our roads, and our farms are all textures that influence that flow of life. And so as we start thinking about nature on a farm, we want to think about it in the context of the landscape, not as some isolated little island that's divorced from the rest of life. And so that's really one of the visions that I'd say that brings an importance to this work, because if you look at the recommendations that have come for managing habitats on farms, be that for conservation, be that for agroecological services, you realize that a lot of those originated not in the Hudson Valley, but they originated in England, they originated in the Central Valley of California, in very different landscapes, and they don't necessarily function the same way here as they did in those places. And so one of our responsibilities, really, I think, as a program is to, in some ways, take advantage of the luxuries that we have to try things out on the farm. Now, we're not dependent on we meaning the researchers, are not dependent on our agronomic production. And so we can try things that, we hope are practical for farmers, but we can take the risks and see if they do or they don't work. And so I think that's one of the motives that we have for doing this work, is to trial some of these techniques. One of the advantages, one of the advantages that the Farm Hub brings is the ability to experiment. And I've looked at insects and other organisms in various habitats around farms. And unless you can experiment, you miss something. You don't really learn perhaps as much as you can. And so one of the advantages of working at the Farm Hub is to be able to do those experiments and actually try things out and see what might be influencing nature, be that again for conservation or be that for agroecological services or both. The other pleasure of working on this program, as you'll hopefully get a feel for in the film, and has already been alluded to by Anne, is that we get to work with a variety of other ecologists. Each ecologist, like every person, and brings their own perspective to the study of life. And so Anne might look at birds, Gabrielle might look at microbes, I might look at insects. And each of us see our own little color of the landscape. But when you can bring everybody together in the same room and actually look at the same piece of land from all these different perspectives, it can be really amazing. And we hope can also produce insights that are useful to other people. So I just wanted to close by actually posing a question to the audience that I'd like to hear feedback on at the end of the film. And that is, in ecology, there are very few yes, no answers. It's usually maybe or sometimes, those wishy-washy sort of answers, but life is complicated. There just rarely are those discrete answers. And not only are they wishy-washy, you have to wait a while to get them. Each year is different, and you have to look through various different years. You have to watch. And so it becomes difficult to know, well, what do you share before you think you know any answers? And so this movie is really not so much about answers as it is about process. It's the process of looking, as Anne was saying, it's the process of looking at life and those little surprises and those little insights. And my question for you is, okay, if we accept this movie doesn't show results, what do you get out of it? What is it that you feel this movie does show or bring to you? And I'd be curious to know that. So there's going to be a Q&A session after this video. It'll be moderated by Joan Apter, and will include both Anne and I and Eddie Clevenger, the farm manager. So with that, I will turn it back over to the host. Farming is ever evolving. Today, when we think about what's to come next, the key question is, how do we produce food and still maintain a livelihood for farmers while respecting the needs of other organisms with which we share the land? Sometimes we overlook the wild organisms. These have value in their own right, and they help produce food by pollinating crops, controlling insects, liberating soil nutrients, and more. Across the country, and importantly here in the Hudson Valley, Many growers work within a food system that does not explicitly encourage or reward farming practices that value biodiversity. Recent biodiversity declines can be partially attributed to the impacts of farming, such as habitat loss, fragmentation and degradation, pesticide-related plant and animal mortality, and the effects of a changing climate on wildlife, plants, soil life, and water quality. Here at the Farm Hub, we've been studying the land's biodiversity for the past few years in an attempt to honor and repair the land while producing food, to explore how agriculture and wildlife can coexist. We call this collaboration Farmscape Ecology. We had done a lot of observational work, trying to look at what insects do you find in which habitats. So if you go into an edge of a field, say, that's got a lot of flowers in it, and maybe some of those are shrubs, and what insects do you find there that you also find in the crop fields? With the idea of, well, maybe which sorts of habitats do you want to encourage in order to encourage beneficials in the crops? But all the situations that we've been able to work in before were observational, they weren't experimental.
We decided that we're going to create these native meadow test plots. What kind of a meadow could we create that, yes, provides flowers for beneficial insects, but might also be a habitat that attracts grassland breeding birds? So these meadows are going into their 3rd year now. And my mentor, who has helped me establish these meadows, always has this nice saying that she says, when you seed a native meadow, you have to expect the 1st year it's going to sleep, the 2nd year it will creep, and the 3rd year it will leap. And so this is the year when we will see our native meadows leaping. So let's go in, do 8 steps, and then our first plot starts. So 1, 2, 3.
These are seed mixes that farmers could put into their farms as habitat for beneficials. But they've not really been test-driven so much in this region, nor in organic situations. And so we're trying to see, 1, can you establish them organically? And 2, does it make any difference? Are you getting the creatures that you hope you're getting?
This is the species-rich seed mix, and then the next plot over is a not-so-species-rich seed mix that has mostly grasses and a few flowering plants. To compare if it actually makes a difference, if you bring a lot of diversity in plants in, does that also increase the diversity of insects? And do you get more of the beneficial insects? Or can you go with the cheaper seed mix that has fewer diversity and get the same effect with the insects?
And the other thing that we've been starting to do is just do some standardized insect monitoring. What we do is we set up traps in the forest, at the forest edge, then 300 feet into the field and 600 feet into the field. Partially the idea is just to understand how insect populations are changing, because I think you probably heard, it's been in the news quite a bit, that in some places there have been substantial insect declines. But that's hard to know unless you have some standardized protocol that you repeat. We sampled insects in a variety of ways. So these traps will just get what's crawling or walking, strolling across the surface. And then the malaise traps are getting what's flying through. I think a lot of people are surprised when you go and you take a net and you just sweep through here, how much life is in there that you had no idea was in there before. The group of insects that you catch most are flies. So we work with the hoverflies, which are the ones that look kind of like bees. And you see a variety of butterflies come through, some of which spend their whole lives here and some of which come in from other places. And you've got the ants, you've got the weevils, you've got the ground beetles. We also get leaf hoppers, which are considered pests, some of the aphids, which are considered pests. What was interesting was that when we looked at the insect communities where the flowers are planted compared to the control, which is just wild, more of the pests were in the wild than were in these plots that have more flowers in them, whereas more of the beneficials more common in this type of a bed. The importance of healthy soil on a farm cannot be underestimated. We study microscopic soil organisms in order to understand both how they shape and are shaped by farming.
So in this case, just so you know, we're looking for DNA. As you do more field ecology, when you go in the field, what we're interested in is the top 2 or 3 centimeters, and we're going to homogenize the soil afterwards. What I want to make sure is that you don't have 1 centimeters or like 12 centimeters, 30 centimeters. This is a classroom of upper college undergraduate at Bard College. Most of them are actually majors in biology or the environmental program that we have at Bard. All of them are interested in ecological questions, some of them in farming questions, to study the impact of the microbiome on our environment, or how do we actually shape the microbiome by our actions.
And even though you have like little grass and stuff, if you can pull it out. So we're basically looking for the microbial diversity within soil, within the different plots that we have at Farm Hub. You have a probe, which basically, once you stab into the ground, picks up soil. We get 5 centimeters of the top of the soil, because that's what we're actually looking for right now, to see what microbial diversity we have within the plants that are growing in the field. And once we have, then you collected all your samples, we take it back to Bard, and then we put it in the fridge until we're ready to process it for DNA extractions.
The goal of this experiment is to see the different bacteria present in the soil, as well as if there's presence of and how much of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Antibiotic resistance is huge right now, and you expect to see it there most likely just because of manure runoff. It doesn't necessarily mean anything awful in small quantities, but in large quantities, it's not good, because then antibiotics don't do as much for you.
Living here in the Hudson Valley and working more with farmers, I just started to actually focus a little bit more on the good side of microbes. So how they can be beneficial for us and how we can actually try to shape our environment to benefit the microbiomes and us down the line as well.
Clean water is as important as healthy soil. We look at how soil conditions can influence crop access to water, how soil erosion and the runoff of fertilizer impacts adjacent waterways, and how no-till versus traditional tilling affect water use.
Till versus non-till. My hypothesis will be tilled land will yield more crops and vegetables versus non-till. But at the same time, soil erosion will be much higher. If we can reduce erosion by doing this, as well as we can conserve our water. And that is the biggest benefit that we can have.
We want to find how much water is needed as a maximum so that they don't waste water resources. On the bottom, there are these little tubes and holes, and altogether that simulates the rainfall onto that ring of ground underneath. And any of the water there will either seep into the soil or run off into here. The more dirt that you find in the water, the more dirt is coming off the land. And that's the erosion that's taking place. And that'll run off into the esopus if it's not controlled.
We are at
one of the banks of Vispo Creek flowing through the farm hub, and this is one of our sample locations. Since the farm hub started new farming practices, they wanted to see how their new farming practices are affecting the water quality. The fertilizers, primarily composed of nitrate and phosphate. There might be a little bit of nitrate when it breaks down. So once we apply this more than we should, that comes to the water bodies. And there will be an ecological effect on those as well. Ultimate goal is, all the farmers that get trained from this farm hub, they will know that, okay, this is doing good for the water quality. So if they apply that, they will release less nitrate to the water bodies.
This is one of the floodplain forests here at the Farm Hub that forms part of the wooded riparian corridors. As ecologists, they are always interesting for us because there's a lot of native diversity hiding in those forests. At the Farm Hub, we spent one summer inventorying the plants in all the different types of habitats on the farm, and we're up to 425 different species of plants, and almost 200 of them occurred in the riparian corridor, although the riparian corridor only takes up 17% of the land of the farm. So the Esopus Creek, which you see here, is a very central piece to the Farm Hub. Basically, the stream has created the amazing agricultural soils of the Hurley Flats. So the Farm Hub probably wouldn't be here were it not for the stream.
The creek and riparian corridor are lush and home to a wide variety of wildlife. Our team of herpetologists tracks the movements of wood turtles as they weave their lives from creek to forest to field and back.
It's over in this direction.
A typical hangout, right?
Yeah, straight ahead of you, I think.
Okay. Okay, I got him here. Yep, okay. I got him here right under my feet.
The male, right?
Yeah, in and amongst this mugwort and Virginia creeper. Boy, what a male.
What's his behavior? Pretty
was that one of the ones we found early on, or is this
yes,
one? It is.
That's
okay.
The first one I attached.
First one? Okay.
To.
Yeah.
What we're trying to understand better here is how wood turtles and agriculture are working together. The male, he likes this spot.
He's been here for the past 3 weeks.
3 weeks? Okay.
This area was cleared.
So we were brought in to get a handle on what the condition of the population is, but really to find out the movement patterns of a small sample of turtles in this population, how those movement patterns relate and interact with some of the active agriculture.
This is a male, Alex?
Yeah, this male should be a few hundred feet ahead of us.
Okay.
Probably pretty deep into the woods, he usually is.
So the wood turtles in general are a declining species for a lot of different factors. In the Hudson Valley, you have areas where there's a lot of farming. And intensive farming has shown that turtles in certain situations don't fare well there and their populations become depleted. Because the Farm Hub is sympathetic to biodiversity issues and the plight of wildlife. We'll be able to come up with a management plan that, marries the conservation objectives of the turtles and the farming objectives. You can see faintly that there are these concentric rings on each of these plates here, which are called scutes. And these rings are called annuli. They closely represent a year's worth of growth. That kind of gives us a, an approximate age of, probably 30 maybe, between 20 and 40 years old. But another impact, which is more in line with what we're studying here, is you can see on the lower part of her carapace, she has that big crack that's more like a scar now. It's healed over. But that's from something exerting a pretty intense amount of pressure on that shell enough to crack it. So it's likely a tractor or some farm equipment over time. And again, that's part of the objective of the study, to see how these turtles navigate an intensively farmed landscape. What we need, however, to know is what the important nesting areas are, because they're the most critical. That's what's going to drive this population long into the future, and to protect those areas, and to maintain, some buffers on the riverine habitat. Farming right up to the river corridor is not going to be sustainable for that species. Predation is natural, that's fine. Other animals got to eat turtles. Turtles always been on the menu for animals for, as long as they've been around. But you compound it with roads, you compound it with farm equipment, you compound it with habitat loss from urbanization. It's not a sustainable situation for the wood turtle. So I think inherently we have a nice protected corridor in the Esopus, and if the turtles, manage working these buffered edges and we protect the nesting habitat, we could maintain this population for a long time from here on out.
Many creatures, besides turtles, move across the farm landscape, connecting, for example, stream corridors and wet swales with the neighboring cropland. Some of these creatures, such as birds and bugs, can both have an effect on production and be affected by production. Monitoring the crops, not just for beneficials, but also for pests, can help balance biodiversity goals and aid in decision-making.
So this is a hay field. We're producing hay, but we're also managing for grassland birds. So far on the farm, we've documented 167 bird species. New things are arriving every day right now, and it really gets you out of bed in the morning. And I'm not just looking at the number of birds and the species, but also the habitat that they're using. And that gives us a sense of, over the course of the season, how the habitats the birds are using changes. And it also allows us to think more about which birds are interacting with the crop areas on the farm. At least for birds, they can be beneficial. It's not always that way. And it doesn't always happen passively. Sometimes we're the part of the equation that makes it beneficial. And so they're initially attracted because they're eating the pests. So that seems good. But then they switch their diet and they begin eating the corn kernels, which, not so good. Causes damage to the ear, makes it undesirable, unmarketable. That seems bad. But some people suggest that you can leverage the good part of what the bird is doing and then mitigate your risk. My job is mainly to collect the information about pest activity in the corn. The sweet corn's in early tassel stage, which means that the tassel is just about to emerge here, and that's the part of the corn that has pollen on it. And I'm looking mainly today for two different corn pests. The European corn borer. I'm mainly looking for egg masses right here along the mid-rib of the leaf, and there's actually one right here. And if this corn is over about 15% infested plants in the field, we would be above a threshold and decide that we needed to take an action in the corn. So one of the ways that we control European corn borer is to put out a biocontrol, and that just means it's a live organism that helps us control pests. So in this case, there's wasps in this small envelope, and they're almost microscopic. And basically the wasps find the eggs of the European corn borer, and they put their eggs inside the eggs of the pest species that we're trying to manage for. And so that helps to reduce the population of European corn borers in the corn. It's interesting, there's areas where we work together to try really hard to manage the habitat, but then there's places like the swales where the change was pretty simple in some ways, and then we decided to leave those areas as is.
So the perimeter of your field is where nature tries to creep in. That's where you get the weeds. So normally that's why you'd obliterate a swale like this, because it's competition to your monocrop. So obviously right over here, we'll farm and plant corn the normal way. Yeah. And here, let's just keep treating this as an island, a place for nature to be inside of our field.
In the case of the swales, that's really changing the status quo about what a farm looks like. When you look at it from the road, it looks like, you know, a little unkempt or a little weedy or like, you know, what's going on over there. But I think it's kind of about working together to change that mindset.
It's the beauty of something that you're not trying to control and you're letting it flourish. And every time you drive out to the field, you're surprised by an egret stalking the marsh, or you're surprised by a blue heron. There would never be in a normal field that's all monocropped in corn or soybeans. So that's one part, I think, is a sense of wonder and partnership with nature.
This is the sound of late summer. When the fireflies start to fade, the sound starts to rise. And so all of these are what you see you see them also if you go in there at the end of summer, and the noisier it is, the more life you've got. And it's a good thing. The meadows continue to evolve, and every year you get a different batch of insects, and that's just par for the course. To get trends and to get effects, you really need to be collecting over several years. We just have very little knowledge of both the variation in time and the variation in space.
We've learned a few things. There are a few species that did not grow very well here, and I will leave them out of future seed mixes. With that, I can make the seed mix cheaper. We're actually going to seed 10 more acres at the Farm Hub this fall, and it's a modified seed mix based on what we've learned, and we could cut the price in less than half.
We're not expecting that any commercial farmer, is going to go and necessarily plant a block like this. But the idea is you have these little nooks and crannies on the farm, the corners that don't get planted, but maybe get mowed just because you don't want them to get really weedy or something like that.
And it is relatively easy to establish them if you're starting from a basically clean field, a former cornfield or a former vegetable garden, and that's what we did here.
Farms can offer something unique in the landscape that many of our current habitats cannot. And then I think in terms of the benefits to agriculture, it's really thinking about the whole system.
Loss of habitat and loss of biodiversity is a global problem that we see here. Sometimes it feels like something we can't tackle, but our relationship to the land can be positive if we make a deliberate choice to make it positive.
Hello. Hi, I'm Joan Apter, and I'm here to moderate the questions and answer session for tonight's program. Now, so far we have one question, so I encourage you to go to the Q&A box and post any questions that you would like our panelists to discuss with you tonight. From Vernon, we have the question, has the floodplain been adversely affected by the turbid water discharges from the Ashokan Reservoir? The diversity, for example?
Don't all speak at once. That's a really good question, and it's not something any of the research projects in the collaborative have specifically looked at, so it's sort of hard to tease that out from what we've looked at so far. It would definitely be something interesting to explore a little bit deeper, but I don't have any solid evidence of that at this point. I'm sure if Shawfield was here, who you saw in the film, who's a hydrogeologist, might have a few things to say about that. But yeah, no, it's not something we've looked at specifically in any of our projects right now. Conrad, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I'm sure I would be sure that there'd be some effect, but what that effect is and whether you deem it positive or negative, yeah, it's not something we're looking at, so I wouldn't have an answer.
Anonymous asks pretty similar question. Do the muddy discharges from the Ashokan Reservoir affect the local biodiversity? I think it sounds like the same question.
Yeah, and I guess I would just share that it's definitely coming up because we can very visibly see that turbidity, about since Christmas with a couple of breaks. So I know it's something that's on everyone's mind that I don't have a great answer to, but what I can share is that I know some folks are steeped in reviewing the draft environmental impact statement for the lower Sopus, which I'm guessing is where some of these questions are coming from. And I will share that the Farm Hub is reviewing that quite deeply right now, and we are also part of an effort to extend the public comment period for that review. It was extended to June 16th. So while I don't have a lot of answers to your questions, I can say that we did advocate for more time for everyone to review what's available so that we can all hopefully make some informed decisions about that topic. So again, sorry that we don't have a better answer for you, but yeah, we definitely hear you on that topic.
Thank you. Hyatt asks, is the seed mix something that's going to be made available to the public, either the list of contents or the mix itself?
Yeah, I can actually put the seed mix list, a link to it. I'll put it in the chat. But you should bear in mind that it's not any golden grail. It's really just the mix that we've tried so far. And actually now as we move on, we're tweaking it. There's things that we found that, we should do something slightly differently. So I'll put that link in the list, but don't take it as a final word by any means.
Thank you. Robin asks, how would academic folks get involved with the Farm Hub? It seems like a wonderful community.
Oh, Conrad, I saw you were unmuted, so I thought you were gonna.
Oh no, I just forgot.
How can academic folks get involved? Well, we're hoping if things ever, quote, go back to normal, that we can hold another public event similar to what we did a couple years ago now at the Ashokan Center, where all of the research partners in the collaborative came out and presented on their work. And that was an opportunity for folks to come and engage and ask questions. We also do on-farm events occasionally. We might be having one coming up in July on the Native Meadow Trail, so folks can come and engage that way. But we are moving into we're hoping to move into the outreach phase of the research collaborative, which is still very much in its infancy, and we hope in the future to have a lot more methods for folks to engage with this work. Conrad, I don't know if you want to add to that at all.
I was just putting the link into the seed mix in the chat. So the link in the chat, seed mix link in the chat. Yeah, I guess I would say the same thing. Yes, find ways of coming to events or on the farm or elsewhere and engaging and thinking about questions. And if there's some aspect of what you see going on that particularly interests you, I think all the researchers would be glad to hook up and link and discuss what they're doing.
Yeah, and I guess on that same note, I would add that, we're pretty approachable. You can email us with any questions. We try to respond to all of them, and we're going to share a document later with our contact info, so you don't have to worry about getting that right now. We'll get that to you, and if anything comes up for you, definitely reach out. I also wanted to mention that we're really lucky tonight that we have Eddie Clevenger on the panel with us, who has a lot more detailed information about growing practices and farming, and we don't always get to have a farmer on the panel. So I would say if you're putting questions in the Q&A and you have some very farmer specific questions, now is your time to ask Eddie.
Thank you. Maxanne asks to Conrad, I believe this film was made several years ago. What have been the lessons learned or observations made in these several years? Are the insects, birds, animals the same over the years? How have the crops changed? How do they interact?
Oofta. No, I mean, one thing one finds is that no one year is the same. So you'll have certain insects one year and they disappear the next, and following year you've got a new batch. So there's a lot of year-to-year variation. And that's one of the things that makes it complicated to try to figure out what any trends are. I think in terms of lessons learned so far, this movie was made a couple years ago. And as I was kind of alluding to with the seed mixes, one thing we're finding is that we have one treatment that has a lot of wildflowers in it. And the bees and the butterflies like that, as you might expect. But like the little parasitoid wasps seem to prefer our controls that are weedy, because they've got lots of little flowers that the wasps like. And then some of the other beneficials and pests also have distinct tastes. So it's really, I think if I were to say, have we learned anything so far? In some ways, it's that life is complicated, which we should have known ahead of time. But I think that's anything you want to add, Anne or Eddie, since crops were mentioned?
I could add, oh, go ahead, Eddie.
No, I would say we're learning every year. I mean, like Conrad said, every year is different. That's one thing I can say about farming. I never get bored with my job because every year brings me new challenges. And yeah, we just have to see what the year brings.
And yeah, I would just add that it's interesting thinking about the history of a sweet corn farm versus today in terms of bird life, not one necessarily being like better than the other, but just a comparison in thinking about farms as habitat. Corn can provide habitat for quite a few birds actually, but the farm hub is now, you know, a little bit more diverse in the crops that we grow and the cover cropping we do. And so we've seen species come in like bobolinks or meadowlarks during the breeding season that I suspect hadn't been there in quite some time. So I think it's interesting, this question of how, you know, what's grown on farms and where and when, and how that can influence the diversity of birds or other species that we see on farms.
And maybe Eddie, you want to take this one on from Mary Ann. What's the biggest lesson learned so far?
The biggest lesson learned is we don't know it all. and every year is different. And I feel really blessed to have such a, you know, a team like Ann and Conrad. You know, we're a large farming operation and we have these great resources that we can pick up the phone day or night and call and say, you know, what is this? We have an issue, you know, and we get an answer. So I feel like I'm really, you know, I'm blessed to have such a wonderful group of colleagues to work with.
And vice versa, that we can say, we'd like to try putting a beetle bank through this field. And Eddie and the other people at the Farm Hub go, yeah, okay, we'll try that.
We don't always say yes right off the bat, just so you know.
And we are actually putting in a beetle bank that you, I think, if you drive slowly, you can see from Hurley Mountain Road over the coming years.
Maybe we should say what a beetle bank is in case people don't know, now that we've been throwing the word around.
Yeah, I guess that kind of crossed my mind.
A beetle bank is actually a double entendre because it's actually a physical berm that runs through a field, but it's also meant as an area where you bank your ground beetles, which are thought of as beneficial. So it's meant to be a bank that is in perennial vegetation, doesn't get plowed. And so ground beetles and other organisms can overwinter there and have a sort of a refuge, and then supposedly diffuse out and give their benefits to the surrounding crops.
Thank you. Conrad, this one's for you from Gerald. Nice to be here. How would I access this kind of information after this excellent presentation?
There's both there will soon be, and there is some information on the Hudson Valley Farm Hub website. Maybe Ann, you could stick that in. And then I'll put in a link to our webpage at Hawthorne Valley Farm, Farmscape Ecology program, and you can look up there.
Thank you. Robin asks, specifically, are you working with anyone who's looking at the social/community aspects of the farm?
Do they mean, this might be kind of my biological centric mind. Do they mean from an ecological standpoint or social from like a humanitarian effort? I'm not sure if it's possible to get clarification on that in the chat.
Robin, if you want to clarify that in the Q&A, I'll get back to you on that.
I'm assuming they mean humanitarian, and like Brooke said, we have our language justice work that ensures that, you know, all voices can be heard in a space. So that's some work we do. And we also do our food access work that Brooke also spoke to a little bit, taking a look at food insecurity in our area. So those are a couple examples if that's what she was asking.
Oh my goodness, we have such a long list of questions.
I know.
Let's continue. Are you working with hydroponics at all? Jim asks. Where? How?
We are currently not.
Okay. Thank you. Eva was asking, how many years does it take to detox the soil of the hub after it has been commercially farmed for so many years?
That's a very good question, and I don't really have an answer for you. I know we have been working very hard on the property since we took ownership in 2014 and 15. We are seeing some changes, but it is slow. It is a slow process. So yeah, more to come. We don't know how long it's going to take.
Thank you. Eugene asks, fellow farmer here, does anyone have a prediction of how spring will play out weather-wise?
Yes, it'll be what it will be. Sorry, I know that's a short answer, but I have no prediction. It looks like it may be a wet spring, but I wouldn't want to speculate on that. Sorry.
Thank you. Melanie asks, the emphasis nowadays on soil health is about carbon sequestration and how to make markets for soil management for carbon. Does that approach help or hurt the less market-based approaches to biodiversity and soil health?
That's a good question. That's a hot topic right now, carbon. We're working on we're doing carbon research on the farm. We're working with Woods End Lab, Will Brinton. We are testing our farm pretty intensively, trying to come up with how we can measure carbon on our farm. We're also working with Hudson Carbon to, we're putting all of our data on a database so people can see it. But the carbon monitoring on the farm is going to take us a little while. We're working on that.
Thank you.
I was just going to add from a biodiversity perspective, in thinking about carbon and some of the incentives around carbon or cover cropping, that one of the partners in the research collaborative, Will Yandick, is looking at a particular warm season cover crop mix that we use at the farm for soil health. And he's looking at it in terms of potentially being good overwintering bird habitat. So I think it's kind of interesting, these questions that emerge of carbon and cover cropping and soil health and how that can tie into biodiversity. It's all very complex ecological web that we're trying to tease out.
Yeah, and I think there's a temptation sometimes to focus on what you can quantify easily or relatively easily, and that you can monetize. And I think that's important. So I think that the carbon sequestration is an important issue, and it's good to look at. I think we just shouldn't at the same time forget some of the more difficult to understand aspects of habitat and biodiversity. So we have to have a mind that's big enough to hold everything at the same time.
Thank you. Anonymous asks, has the stilt grass invasion come to the Farm Hub? How are you managing it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I, in my history, have some experience working at Minnewaska State Park managing stilt grass, and it's quite an uphill battle. I don't feel, after working on that project, that eradication is necessarily a viable option. I think at one point people were looking at biocontrols to help control stilt grass, but I don't know if a lot of progress has been made, and it's not something we're actively managing at the Farm Hub right now, but it certainly is present, like it is in so many places in our landscape. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Conrad.
The only control that I've heard of recently is flame weeding. Not sure how effective that is, but I think they are doing a study at that to see how workable that is.
Thank you. Gail asks, how does deer browse affect the crops and your patches of native flora and species diversity in general? Eddie's smiling.
I'm waiting for Conrad to answer this one.
I'm not going to go. Well, I can go after I can talk about my own crops. Go ahead, Anne. That's a good. You take it.
Yeah, I also, in my history, I've worn many hats over the years. Actually used to look at deer browse impacts at the Mohonk Preserve, and then started thinking about deer browse in a different context when I came to the Farm Hub, because I also scout crops at the Farm Hub for pest and disease issues, and we definitely are not immune to damage by deer at the Farm Hub. It's kind of a complex landscape scale puzzle. There's certain really sensitive crops at the farm that we exclude deer from with electrical fencing. And sometimes it's just, you know, the damage happens and maybe reduces the yield, but uh-oh, I'm getting into Eddie territory. I should hand it over to you now. I said the word yield, so take it away.
Yeah, I mean, we have a certain amount of damage every year from deer. Seems to be manageable to in some parts of the farm. So yeah, I mean, we're yeah, no different than anybody else.
Thank you. We have a few questions about from Gerald, Philip, a few others. Is the film accessible after the showing? Is it available to download, et cetera, et cetera?
I was just going to put in the chat. I just got it. I'll put the link in for Vimeo to the movie. I'm putting it in the chat right now.
Oh, you're going to beat me to it. I was about to put it in the chat. But yeah, it's available on the Ocean's 8 Hope on the Hudson page. It's available on the Farm Hub page. There's quite a few places you can watch it for free. And yeah, Conrad just put the link in the chat.
Excellent. Here's another question from George about the pollinator mix. And you mentioned that you were going to put that in the chat.
It is in the chat. Somebody said that I put a second one in because somebody said the first one I put in wasn't working, but it did go into the chat. And hopefully I think there's an email being sent out at the end to participants, and we can put the link in there too.
Okay, great. Jim asks, are you working with any greenhouses that are growing vegetables in cold weather months? Where are these greenhouses? Do they produce food for local markets and/or stores?
We're currently growing leafy greens in the winter in our heated greenhouses, but that's about all we're growing. We haven't ventured out into any other crops. Leafy greens, kales, collards, and spinaches and stuff like that.
Okay. Anonymous asks, asking for a teacher at Kingston City High School. What's the first active step you would recommend students could take to start acting on these issues? How can they become more engaged?
Go out and find some flies to look at. No, I'm just kidding. But really, I think sometimes just starting to make observations can really pique your curiosity and kind of like pull you into the subject matter. So even if it sounds silly, even finding like, you know, dandelions to watch on the sidewalk or ants eating crumbs in your driveway. I find so much inspiration in just observing the natural world and engaging that way. And then, yeah, there's a whole slew of ways you can get involved in the document that we've shared a link to. So you can also look for some ideas there. Conrad, or Eddie, did either of you have anything to?
No, I would second you, Anne. Just find some organisms that you love and watch them, and they'll lead you on a path.
For sure.
Literally and figuratively.
Thank you. Can you review the interrelationship between the crop and wildflower fields? How do they benefit one another?
Well, theoretically, the idea is, and this is why NRCS will do cost share with farmers to install wildflower meadows. The idea is that by putting in a wildflower meadow, you attract beneficial insects or invertebrates, you could say, so spiders as well. You attract spiders that are generalized pest predators. You attract bees, who are pollinators, parasitoid wasps who parasitize and kill various pests. So that's the theory. Now, what we've been trying to do, and this doesn't appear in the movie, but we've been planting crops next to the wildflower treatment. We have wildflowers, we've got a lot of grasses in another treatment. We have a fallow also as part of those treatments. And then looking at harvest and trying to see what the effects are. And I will say that to date, the results are nuanced. As you can imagine, it's complicated. You get the wasps come to those fallows. The bees maybe get distracted from pollinating the crops because they see all the wildflowers. So there's a theory and there's a practice, and we don't quite know exactly what's happening at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Ellen asks, can you describe the relationship between the farm production and the Farmscape research at the Farm Hub?
Again, it's to try to. Eddie, do you want to say something?
Wait, go ahead. I'll chime in when you're done.
I was just going to say the same thing, that the hope is that we can come up with some types of habitat management that not only benefit biodiversity, but also benefit production. That when we put this beetle bank through the cornfield, that perhaps it has benefits that actually seep out into the corn. That's the hope. We shall see.
Yeah, and it's ongoing. I mean, we're trying every year to see what works and what doesn't work. You know, maybe it's a timing thing. It could be a week, waiting a week to do something that makes a big difference. We don't know.
Could be the year, a dry year, a wet year.
Yep, that's right. Good, very much.
I mean, the other thing that's really cool to me is that, you know, we really want these potential solutions to be farmer feasible, and being able to work at a farm where we have ecologists and growers together. You know, Eddie can step in if we're putting the beetle bank in and it makes no sense for the crop plant or the farming operation. Like, he can say, you know, like, we can't get our equipment around that, or like it's in the way, or we should, you know, it's like, it's kind of creates an environment where we can sort of hash some of that stuff out, and hopefully the end result, in theory, potentially works for both farmers and biodiversity.
Okay, thank you. Molly asks, in relationship to time, what does the Farm Hub think about what is reasonable to expect in terms of knowing that an ecological program on a farm works? What ought one think about ecological ROI versus farm output ROI?
I don't know what ROI means. To
return on investment.
Oh, return on investment. I'm obviously not a financial. It goes back to this process question in my mind. I think one output that we would hope for is exactly what's happening, hopefully happening right now, in that people are starting to think about these issues, and when they look at organisms on a farm, maybe see a slightly different depth, or organisms in their backyard. In terms of knowing, you know, it may be, in terms of having ecological results, it may be something where we learn what maybe is not necessarily worth doing from an agricultural perspective in our area, and are just honest with people and say, look, if you want to do this, it's great. It may help biodiversity, but we don't personally yet have indication that it does help production, or vice versa. Perhaps we will find something that does help production. So I think it's ongoing, and having the process is one of the important things. And Eddie?
It's hard for me to believe that it doesn't help production. Like Conrad said, I mean, I believe it does. I don't know to what extent it does, but I'm a firm believer that it does.
It's so interesting you say that, because so many people are already kind of like, quote unquote, sold on the fact that it works. And meanwhile, in the collaborative, we're like, whoa, we need to take a little bit closer look at, you know, X, Y, or Z. And so I guess that makes me feel good, because it means that in a way, like the community is already behind us in valuing biodiversity in the food system. And even if we don't have all the answers right now, yeah, it feels good that there's like kind of like cheerleaders leading us on, I guess.
Thank you. Now this is the last question, and there's so many more wonderful questions. Charles asks, I grew up during the time of crop rotation and non-chemical farming in the Midwest. Is that part of your process as well?
Very much so. We're on a 3-year crop rotation currently at the farm. Like Brooke said earlier, we're about 1,500 plus or minus acres. About 1,000 of that, or a little better, is in crops. 100 of that being in vegetable crops, and the balance being in field crops that we call corn, soybeans, beans, and/or wheat or small grains. And like I said, we're on a 3-year rotation. We're cover cropping to meet the needs of the next year's crop. Sometimes as many as 8 species in the mix. So yes, we're very much doing that. It's very much a part of our life.
Thank you. Well, thank you to everyone who posted all these huge, long lists of questions. And that concludes the question and answer session. I'm going to hand it back over to Georgia Asher, who's going to close it up for us tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you all for this wonderful presentation. Both thank you to the Farm Hub people and also to our organization, the Woodstock Film and Discussion Series, who were, and to also the people behind the scenes who made this happen. And of course, thanks to everyone, all of you who attended this webinar. Now, the What Can I Do list, which is a resource list that you saw presented in the chat, and a link to the YouTube recording of this video, plus I believe some of the other resources that were mentioned during this presentation will be emailed to you in a few days if you signed up for this webinar. Also in a few days, you'll be able to find a link to this YouTube video, the recording of this particular event, at the Woodstock Land Conservancy website and also on the Hudson Valley Farm Hub website. I want to point out also that the Woodstock Film and Discussion Series will have its last presentation of the season, entitled Regenerative Agriculture for Human and Planetary Health. There'll be a viewing of a really good short film called Farmer's Footprint, and that'll be followed by Q&A and discussion. Okay. This is about no-till farming, which uses crop and cover crop rotation rather than pesticides. This method of farming removes CO2 from the air and sequesters carbon in the soil. This produces nutritious food and the benefits of carbon sequestration. And you can learn in this presentation how you too can employ these ancient regenerative practices, even in your own backyard garden. You can also learn how you can contribute to the goal of building a resilient food system for our community. So this event is happening on April 26th. It's the last event in our series this season. So we hope that you can attend it. And again, thanks so much for being here for this event, and have a good night.